Those of you who've been following my blogs, you all know by now that I'm blogging about grades, and over the past few weeks I've tried to kind of cover certain concepts, such as, firstly, how do grades affect motivation? Do they decrease intrinsic motivation? Also, do they reduce creativity in favour of conformity? And finally, I discussed about gamification and whether that had positive or negative effects. And today I want to discuss something that, as psychologists, we're always encouraged to think about when we're collecting research data and analysing the data, is that the measures that we use to collect that data, are they valid and reliable? Are they a good indicator of what has actually been measured? And so, bearing this in mind, my question of the day is to establish whether grades are a reliable or valid measure of student learning. So I want you to think about how important, firstly, grades are to students. Like, I was just listening to the previous talk over there, which was really interesting about grades, and assessments and the awarding of grades are what constitutes how learning is measured in education. There isn't really another way to measure students' learning apart. Well, what's happening at the moment is that learning is only being measured via assessments. So, you know, there's no real other measure of learning going on, because everything that we do in our degree is graded, and that leads, you know, that is condensed into our final degree classification. And so, as students, it's really important for us to be graded fairly and, you know, validly. And so it's important that the way in which learning is measured in order to award a grade is valid and reliable. Yeah, I've just said that, sorry. Race said that assessing a learner's work is one of the most important things a teacher can do for them, because of the implications that the resulting grades have on their future. So basically, you know, Jess, as a teacher, I know he doesn't like giving grades, but his evaluation of our work is important for us because of the degree classification and what that degree means to us. You know, a degree, when we get our degree, that's an indication to future employers that we are, you know, if I come out of this education with a first, that's going to indicate to my future employers that I'm competent, that I have learnt, and that, you know, I'm able to produce, you know, to use the skills that I have acquired and apply them to problem solving. So I'd like to talk about the definitions of validity and reliability. I won't go into this too much because obviously, you know, it was hammered into us in our first 2 years in university. So there's loads of different definitions of validity. I think it depends largely on what you're measuring, because obviously there's different definitions of validity in qualitative and quantitative research, but specific to education, I found a good definition by Hammersley, and he said that an account is valid or true if it represents accurately those features of the phenomena that is intended to describe, explain, or theorize. So that's quite a formal definition. And, you know, a simpler definition by Black and Champion said that validity is the degree to which a measure measures what it is supposed to. So, you know, validity is I'm claiming that I'm measuring this construct, and that is actually what I'm measuring. So, moving on to reliability, Black and Champion defined reliability as the ability to measure consistently and to maintain the capacity to yield the same measurement. And Johnson and Pennypacker said that reliability is equal to stability. And Race said that reliable measures should be trustworthy, consistent, and fair. So there's this talk about fair. So as students, we should think that our teachers are providing a trustworthy, fair, and valid representation of what work we are producing. So now, referring back to grading systems, I'm going to spend a bit of time evaluating to what extent grades are valid and reliable. So first, consider validity. When you are in an exam, what is that exam measuring? Because if an exam was a valid indicator of, you know, a valid measure, then that assessment should be measuring how well we've learned. And that's what educators claim as well. Educators claim that assessments measure what has been learnt and how well it has been learnt with reference to particular learning outcomes. So all exams are designed around specific learning outcomes, and they assess how well students have learnt in relation to those learning outcomes. And this is what educators want our employers to think as well, that, you know, when they interview a student who has a first-class degree, who has had A's in all their modules, that should be a valid representation of what they have learned. And so if I went for an interview, I had my first, and the interviewer should be believing that I would be able to transfer all my skills acquired in my degree to real-world situations in future employment. But what educators don't tell you, that assessments are a measure of how well learners write rather than how much they learn. So if you think about an exam, you're expected to produce work that demonstrates what you've learnt by answering, say, 3 or 4 SAQs and then an essay question at the end. During that time, you're expected to write quickly, concisely, and you're supposed to condense months and months and months of learning into a 2-hour time period. Now, does that 2-hour exam adequately measure learning, and is it even humanly possible to condense months of learning and acquisition of skills into 2 hours? And is that a fair or valid representation of what you have learned? And so in response to this, Race said that what is measured is not learning, but neatness, speed and eloquence of learners' writing. And it's not just in exams. You think about revision, how students prepare for an exam. I know that when I revise, I don't know what's going to come up on the exam, so I just try and learn, you know, everything that I can. I try and get a really good, you know, idea of the concepts that, you know, and I revise more what I think is going to be on the exam. So, you know, maybe I'll do some past papers. I know a lot of my peers, they will just kind of do past papers so that they get a really good feeling of how the questions on that exam are set. But does that demonstrate learning, or does that demonstrate the ability, you know, does that demonstrate what you have learned in your degree, or does that demonstrate what you have learned in order to how to sit an exam, how to pass an exam? So it doesn't necessarily indicate that you're good, that you've learned a lot. It just indicates that you've learned how to pass an exam and get a good grade. So Becca commented on my blog as well. I always, you know, she always comments on my blog, which I like. She always gives me, you know, really useful information that I can then bring into my talks. And she said that the way in which teachers mark assessments are also not necessarily valid, because teachers are required to objectively decide who has the best work. So the students who produce the best work get A's, then the mediocre ones get kind of lower end B's and C's, and then, you know, the poorer work gets D's. But how do teachers decide what is the best? What criteria determines what is the best? And I read in a blog by Peter Segrist, this is a blog that Jess mentioned to me earlier on in the year, and he wrote that current grading systems reflect a mechanism based on the priorities of the individuals with the power to decide. And I think that's important, because teachers have the power to decide, and Jess has the power to decide whether my blog this week gets an A, or whether my blog this week gets a C or a D or even a fail. And that's fair enough, but I'll talk about this more in reliability as well, because this comes into reliability, but different teachers place different emphasis on different things. So whereas I know that Jess likes to see the learning, I know that Jess mentioned that other teachers in the faculty place more emphasis on APA referencing, spelling, grammar, and so they're not focused on the actual idea that is trying to be presented. They're more focused on how it is written, and that goes on to reliability. So I'll move on to reliability now. Brown and Smith said that reliability can be achieved by inter-rater marking. So that's, you know, several assessors marking the same piece of work and then coming to a unified decision. But they argue that all assignments must be marked to the same standard to establish reliability. So this is my problem, this is what I was saying. It's unrealistic to suggest that all teachers mark in the same way. They can't possibly mark every single piece of work to the same standard. You know, like I said, Jess has, you know, disclosed to me that he prefers to see the learning, what the idea that the student is trying to put across. But I know that from experience that certain teachers in the faculty will, you know, reduce your grade from an A to a C, or maybe even below, if you haven't referenced properly, or, you know, if you spell something wrong. Anyway, well, maybe not as harsh as that if you produce a wrong spelling, but it's that kind of concept. And that leads me to wonder that what would happen if a student produces, say, an informatively innovative piece of work that's novel, but it contained a few spelling mistakes and incorrect APA referencing. Depending on who that teacher is, I might get an A for my idea, or I might get a C because I didn't reference my, I didn't produce the correct references. And finally, before I finish my talk, I also want to mention Miller's Law. We all know about the 7 plus or minus 2. The average human can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 objects in their working memory at one point. And, I have to give some credit to the teachers. When they're marking our work, they have to take into account what grade they want to give us, and that's like from an A star to an F3, that's like, 18 different categories. Then they have to remember the grammar, they have to remember the spelling, they have to remember the APA referencing. The APA referencing is so particular that, the full stop in the wrong place, oh, that's wrong, okay. And they also, they have to remember everything as well on the particular marking criteria, and that is considerably more than 7 plus or minus 2. So you have to give, teachers aren't robots, they're not machines, they are, and unless they are robots, they can't produce marking to the same standard every time. A paper that they mark at, say, 10 in the morning, it might be different to a paper they mark at 10 at night, even if it was exactly the same work. So I want to round up and say that these discrepancies in the validity and reliability of grading systems lead me to question their place in learning environments. If grades are not valid or reliable, they are of little use to the students who receive them, let alone to future employers who regard them as valid and reliable indicators of our ability. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
One thing I would say that does surprise me, you know how I feel about grading, but one thing that does surprise me is when I go into an exam board year after year after year and you see a fairly consistent profile for a student. So whatever it is that's getting graded, people do kind of agree on whatever that quality is.
Yeah, I think that is because students who get high grades, the students who get higher grades are probably able to learn more as well as, because they're learning to apply themselves in exams, so they're probably learning more as well. Does that make sense? So I think maybe it's not as valid or reliable as we would like, but there's got to be some reliability and some validity there, otherwise why would we be using it?
And it does always surprise me how it does give me a bit of confidence in the system, that it kind of does work.
Yeah. So. But as well, what is the alternative? Like the talk that we were listening to just now, with Red and Green about grading systems. I'm looking forward to reading her blog next week because she's going to present an alternative, and I still can't think of something that's as that measures student learning as what in the way that assessments do.
The grades is the conformity that goes along with it, which crushes creativity. That's my biggest problem with it. Because I think we are kind of measuring something that kind of works. But the very nature of what we're doing says you can't be creative. You have to fit the box.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree. Anybody else have any questions? No? Thank you.